The fact that I've come up here and standing behind a lectern does not betoken that I have a speech. You will be very pleased to know, because whatever else you did today, you did not come here to listen to me. What you did come here today was to do various other things which are far more important than listening to me ever can be. Indeed, I'm yet to find anyone who ever thinks listening to me has any importance whatsoever. What we are doing here today, what you are doing here today, is engaging in a remarkably timely and important conversation about some of the most pressing issues that we as a society, domestically but also as an international society, needs to reflect on and to think our way through how we engage in the contemporary world with the problems that we know are part of our past and our legacies, and how we engage with those problems today and move forward together into the future. And in a sense, those are themes which resonate directly to the heart of this college and what this college has for many years been all about. Our origins go back into the mid of the 18th century, when where people got together to try to form pathways through the creation of opportunities for education and thinking for young people who were excluded from the mainstream debates and had no place in those mainstream debates, basically because of who they were, because of their beliefs. At that point, because, of course, you could not engage in such debates and discussions unless you came from particular religious and social communities. And many of those of the Baptist faith did not, and so could not be a part of that, along with very many others. And through that tradition, the college helped create and feed into the climates that have changed that. So we are very conscious that we as a college, small though we are, play an important part in the history of opening up thought to what once were considered radical and unfashionable ideas to become the mainstream, to become the norm. And that is something that we are proud of. We are also proud to be able to do this through our new centre, the Centre for Black Theology, which the college is today launching through the work of our friend and colleague Anthony Reddie. As you may know, Anthony came to the college to be the director of our long-standing Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture a number of years ago. And through his guidance and through his leadership, its focus evolved and changed, reflecting the pressing issues that he felt that we should be engaging with. And as a result of that, of course, gaining recognition through the university to be our first Professor of Black Theology within the University of Oxford here. And it seemed absolutely appropriate to build on that recognition and that success by moving the focus of our research work here within the college to create a new focus based on the work of Black theology and the work of the centre. So this is an important moment for the college. It is a milestone for the college, and I'm delighted to be able to be here to share that with you today. We look forward greatly to the work of the centre moving forward. We expect and we can see that that will be done in partnership with many others. Nothing can be achieved on our own. This is something that we have long known but sometimes seem to forget. And reaching out and finding friends, finding partners, and yes, sometimes finding those who we might not naturally think as friends and partners, but with whom we need to discuss, engage and dialogue in order to try to find new ways forwards to better understand our places in the world, our places in society, and how we are to achieve the sort of world we want to be in. And let's face it, these are challenging times for the world in which we live at the moment. And so places such as this, conversations like this, which in a calmer and rational atmosphere can explore what the future may be for us all and how we can contribute to creating the space that we want to be living in, are so important. And with that, let me also thank the Council for World Mission, who of course are working in partnership with the Centre in the organisation, construction and delivery, and I hope follow-up in future of what has been discussed here today. So with that, I will not carry on, otherwise once again I will breached my own injunction not to be giving you a speech, but merely a welcome, let me again just welcome you all to Regent and hope that you have a really, really excellent day and join me in the celebration of the beginning of a body of work which I trust and hope will be truly transformatory. Thank you very much indeed.
Just a few basic housekeeping rules before I hand over to my colleague Graham. Okay, so first, we're not planning on having a fire drill. So if it goes off, it's probably the real thing. So walk in a purposeful, but obviously not too fast unless you trip over manner. And if you sort of head out through those doors, through the opening doors, then onto Puget Street. I think that's where we assemble. Hopefully, we're not planning to do that, but if it does arise, then hopefully you know where to go, and hopefully that will be enough insiders who'll be able to guide you along the way. If you need the toilets, we have some gents' toilets in this building. So if you go out, turn left, go down the steps, there's some gents down there. For the women, if you go across the quad, and then there are some unisex toilets that are opposite the hall, and then there are some women's only toilets on the first floor, I think, if you go up the steps. So hopefully, again, there'll be people who will be able to guide you. We have lunch at 12:30, and if you registered, then you are free to join us. If you have not registered, then obviously you have to, I guess, look deep into your own soul and decide whether you should come and join us or not. As it is, I think we have booked for 42 people, and there's not 42 here at the moment. So I think grace may well abound if you have not registered. I think that's about it. Oh, we got a short break at 11:15. That is just a very quick comfort break, so don't go too far. We're going to sort of try stick to the time in the program. I know all of us are busy, and we are so grateful that you have made time in your busy schedule to be here. And so if we can sort of try and hold the time. So when we break for lunch at 12:30, we will escort you in a kind but quite deliberate manner, to get from here into the hall so that we are not keeping the kitchen staff who do a marvellous job, but we're not kind of, leaving them really, as a waiting around. So hopefully we will sort of try and be determined to keep to schedule. With that in mind, I think that's pretty much what I need to say at this moment in time now. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Graham McGowan. Is that you, Pinner? That's fine. Okay. It's my friend Graham, who is from our partners, the Council for World Mission, who have made all of today possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. Good morning.
Good morning.
And I'm going to say this, welcome to Oxford. And as someone who grew up in Glasgow and was told that university wasn't something for a boy like me, it's quite important to say welcome to Oxford. Thank you to Professor Anthony Reddie for having the vision to help us convene this day. And thank you to all of you for having the interest to come and engage and converse and do other things as well. The Council for World Mission is the inheritor of the London Missionary Society. And about 8 or 9 years ago, the Council for World Mission began to examine its complicity with legacies of slavery. That was a project that was led by Michael Jagasar, who's with us. Michael, nice to see you, and also Peter Cruchley. And they did some amazing and pioneering work, which at that time put the Council for World Mission at the forefront of discussions on legacies of slavery and reparations. Following that piece of work that they did, the Council for World Mission initiated a research project led by Professor Anthony Reddie and Dr. Carol Troop. And the fruit of that research is this book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Mission and Empire. We have brought copies of the book, and CWM is gifting these to you today. So if you're interested in acquiring a copy, you don't have to pay us. We're paying for our sins of the past. So please feel free to collect a book, which is another element of the discussion initiated by the Council for World Mission on Legacies of Slavery. Nowadays, the Council for World Mission calls Legacies of Slavery the Onesimus Project. And I'm sure that during today we'll have some discussion about that, and I know that Thandi's presentation will offer us some very sharp critique about that. It would be interesting with the other research projects and churches in the room to understand a little bit your reaction to the Onesimus narrative that CWM has chosen to take forward this work. The Council for World Mission describes itself as an anti-racist, anti-capitalist and anti-colonial organisation. Since the 1970s, it has been an organisation that's understood in practice what it calls the decolonisation of mission. And perhaps most symbolically, that's embodied in the move of the headquarters from London to the global south. We can debate again if Singapore is really the global south. That's the rationale. So we try to embody what we would call decolonising of mission through anti-racism, anti-capitalist and anti-colonial mission work. The decolonial and liberationist paradigm is fundamental to what CWM does, and that's why it's so good to be with Professor Anthony Reddie and building on his work of Black liberation theology. So just to say welcome to everybody. We hope you feel very free, that we can engage freely on what is, I'm sure, for many of the churches and research projects here, the most important issue of the day. And it's very good to be able to publicly be here and take this work forward. There is a programme at the back which most of you should have, so just to run you through this quickly. This morning we're going to essentially have two keynote speakers, and we'll have some time for question and answers. And we'll also be able to continue those conversations over lunch in the dining room. And then after lunch we're going to come back and we're going to form a panel and be able to have some maybe deeper discussions on some of the issues that we might have heard or reflected on in the keynotes, but also some of the issues that we might be carrying with us from our own work with the churches and the research institutions that we're involved with. So all contributions are welcome. We want to say this is a safe space. We are going to be recording the two keynote speeches this morning. That's so that the Centre for Black Theology can make that resource available on its website afterwards. But we won't be recording the panel discussion this afternoon so that people can speak more freely. And this is what we might call, in a very white way, the Chatham House Room. I think that's all I want to say. Let me just then introduce our first keynote speaker, who is Thandi Soko-de Jong. Thandi is originally from Malawi, but she's been residing in the Netherlands for a number of years. She is a researcher and writer, and she has been involved with the Council for World Mission for a number of years, also with the World Council of Churches. Thandi is one of our CWM scholars, and she's currently undertaking her doctoral research at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. And so we're delighted that Thandi, in amidst all the commitments, because you've just returned from Zambia, you're able to come to the UK, come to Oxford today, and to share with us. You've been part of the conversations about legacies of slavery and the Onesimus Project for a number of years, and that gives you great experience and insight beyond your scholarly nous to be able to share with us. So we're delighted then to invite Thandi to offer the first keynote speech, and after that we'll have a time for questions and answers. Thandi, welcome.
Morning, everyone. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for your patience. I had to open up my laptop. I hope you can hear me clearly at the back. If my voice becomes low, just let me know, and I'll try to speak as loud as I can. And I also know that for some people, Malawi is a very small country, so sometimes I'm the first Malawian some people have met. So if I say things differently, pronounce them different, feel free afterwards to let me know where I can try and repeat some of the things. So, the title of my presentation today is Just Repair and Legacies of Enslavement and Colonization. The starting point of my presentation today is the Onesimus narrative in the epistle to Philemon. I know that some people say Philemon, but in Malawi we say Philemon, so just bear with me. So the epistle to Philemon is interesting for its contradictory themes. The epistle highlights reconciliation on the one hand, but facilitates a conditional, transactional repair on the other. The contradictory themes present a valuable opportunity for reflection on theology of reparations. The reconciliation theme, as presented in the epistle, seems to approach the conversion of an enslaved man to Christianity as a tool to circumvent addressing the enslavement of individuals or reparations. Onesimus' conversion to Christianity was fully acknowledged by Paul, his new spiritual father, and Philemon, his Christian master. However, the two anticipated a future relationship that would be conditional and transactional. In the epistle, Paul and Philemon do not discuss Onesimus' history or the circumstances surrounding his capture. They also do not address the reasons for Onesimus' escape, such as whether he fled captivity to reclaim his freedom and return to his society. Instead, Paul focuses on negotiating a reconciliation that would keep Philemon attached to Onesimus in a new, predetermined, faith-based relationship. Paul does this without first challenging the system that facilitated the enslavement of individuals and societies, or seeking to address the injustice committed against Onesimus and other people enslaved by Philemon. This suggests a transactional repair in that the reconciliation described in the epistle depended fully on Onesimus' status as a convert to Paul's and Philemon's religion. Paul and Philemon upheld the status quo. Their example was mirrored by Christian leaders that came later, like the 18th century missionary Reverend Johann Wilhelm Carls. Reverend Carls proclaimed a vision of, quote, a peaceful and equal coexistence that did not disrupt the institution of slavery outright. Another contradictory theme in the epistle worth reflecting on is the fact that Onesimus is silent in the narrative. Nothing is said about his background, his origins, or how he was enslaved. Paul and Philemon seem to take it for granted that Onesimus' usefulness is dispensed to him through first his enslaved status and later his conversion to Christianity, rather than through his being God's image bearer as they are. As such, Onesimus is portrayed as a man without agency who moves through a series of subjugated positions, first as an enslaved individual, then as a fugitive, a runaway enslaved man, a prisoner, and finally a convert in need of Paul's patronage. Paul and Philemon are presented as the decision makers who hold the power to control Onesimus' fate. Prior to his escape, his master, Philemon, had exerted power over him. This encompassed profiting and benefiting from Onesimus' physical and intellectual labor. The epistle does not challenge this past and just relationship between the two and offers no explanations for Onesimus' escape from Philemon. This suggests that for Paul, Onesimus' conversion did not necessitate a fundamental change in the relationship between the latter and Philemon. Rather, Onesimus was to return to Philemon and remain subordinated financially, socially, and spiritually to him. Only Philemon's grievances are taken into consideration by Paul, 1 Corinthians 7:21-24 sheds light on Paul's general point of view. According to Dahlem-Datiri, Paul's perspective in the passage is that, quote, obedience to God is more important than trying to change one's circumstances or even seeking freedom from enslavement. Although Paul does add in verse 21 in some translations that if you can gain your freedom, do so. As such, in the epistle, Paul simply returns Onesimus to Philemon and offers Philemon compensation for what Onesimus may owe him. Philemon is depicted as the one who was unjustly treated, while Onesimus is encouraged to move on from the injustice of enslavement without any reparations for his forced labor. In this context, conversion to Christianity offered Onesimus no material benefit in his unequal relationship with Philemon. A more just response by Paul ought to have included his rejection of the belief that one human can determine another human's usefulness. This rejection would require Paul to teach that all humans are God's image bearers. Consequently, no one has a God-given right to exploit another human's perceived usefulness. Such a conviction would have enabled Paul to instruct Philemon to repent of enslaving Onesimus and anyone else he might have enslaved, thereby robbing them of human agency, dignity, and autonomy. Philemon's response, therefore, ought to have been one of humbly seeking forgiveness from all those he had enslaved and financially compensating them for the years they endured under enslavement. Onesimus' worth was not measured by traits like his capacity to think, his wisdom or character. Rather, his worth was, quote, measured by his usefulness, how much his hands could do, and how much hard work he could endure in chains. As such, according to Obusitswe Tiroyaboni, his future was not determined by how much he was willing to study or how far he was willing to go in order to advance in life. His future was already determined by a system influenced by Aristotelian concepts of natural slavery. That system had already decided that he was to belong to another person. After all, he was not a Greco-Roman citizen. Such justifications extended to theology and pseudosciences that embraced the idea of race, that held that the race-based system of chattel enslavement was natural and or God-ordained. For example, Thomas Carlyle, an influential Scottish writer and philosopher, sought to help keep the enslavement of non-Europeans alive by reminding his peers that they were chosen by God to be the vice-regent of the nation. As such, they were elected to a perpetually dominant role over non-Europeans and the environment. From this perspective, abolition would have set the laws of nature and the gods and forced Europeans to work for their own living. And so in this slide is about the Akan man renamed Onesimus. So I'm trying to go from the biblical narrative to the past few centuries. In Strangers in the House of God, Cotton Mather, Onesimus, and an experiment in Christian slaveholding, Catherine Escu draws parallels between the biblical Onesimus and an 18th century African man who was renamed Onesimus. The Akan Onesimus was enslaved by a New England Puritan reverend named Cotton Mather, who renamed him after the biblical Onesimus for reasons I will discuss shortly. Mather, the Reverend Mather, was gifted with the Akan Onesimus by his congregation. In giving him the name Onesimus, he hoped that the Akan man would emulate the example of his biblical namesake by becoming useful to Mather through his skill, ingenuity, and labor at a time when public opinion in New England held that Africans lacked the Enlightenment gifts of rationality and reason. The Akan Onesimus is credited with teaching Mather about the practice of smallpox inoculation, but he also rejected conversion to Christianity. However, Mather was keen to Christianize Onesimus and was disappointed that despite his efforts, with time, Onesimus became, according to Mather, more wicked, useless, obstinate, and uncivil. Coe describes this situation as one in which Onesimus was caught in the strangest of paradoxes. On the one hand, he was made a permanent stranger by a culture that stripped him of the rights of personhood and viewed him as the property of another. On the other, he was made a member of a family that incorporated him into their hopes for a sanctified household. Onesimus seems to have recognized the fiction of Christianized slavery for what it was. That is, his enslavement was incompatible with claims of Christian kinship. Neither freed Onesimus later, but gave him no reparations. Rather, he maintained the hierarchical relationship between them by requiring him to continue serving his household in a regular but smaller capacity. This was likely to ensure that Onesimus remained in his station in life, that is, in a position of subordination. Like the biblical Onesimus, Onesimus experienced the superficiality of Christian kinship as they both remained indebted to their Christian masters despite obtaining freedom through conversion and manumission, respectively. The two Onesimus narratives illustrate that reparations are out of the question when reconciliation or kinship supersede the importance of just repair after conversion. As shown in the two Onesimus stories, conversion by itself does not lead to reparations. Reparations can only be deliberate and intentional policies. Broadly speaking, in the context of the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans, reparations are about financially compensating peoples of African descent on the continent and in the African diaspora for the harms perpetrated against them. And reparations are not new. As with Philemon, it is mostly the owners of enslaved people that have been compensated so far. In the 19th century, after abolition, plantation owners received compensation from their governments. For example, whites, so-called slave barons in Suriname, received 16 million florins as indemnity for emancipated enslaved people. In Suriname and many other places, freed enslaved people and their descendants have received, quote unquote, not a penny. Reparations require accounting for the ongoing accumulation of wealth derived from the transatlantic enslavement of Africans and its legacies, and based on this accounting, paying reparations to the descendants. Researchers, activists, and advocates have argued that reparations for the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans and its legacies, perpetuated through systemic racism, should consider the following: that not only have there been specific harms historically perpetuated, but the generational effects have been ongoing, resulting in disparities in healthcare, life expectancy, wealth, housing, safety, policing, educational and employment opportunities, and so much more. Thus, reparations are needed to try to make up for generations of racism and oppression so that people are brought to a place of equal opportunity and well-being. In light of what has been highlighted so far, Just Repair approaches reparations as rectifying acts that include reparative justice that is both transformational and holistic. Transformational reparative justice recognizes the need to financially contribute to enabling the transformation of groups, communities, and societies out of intergenerational cycles of dispossession, coloniality, impoverishment, discrimination, and exclusion. Holistic reparations recognize that the destruction and dispossession over the past centuries was intentional and wide-ranging and encompassed peoplehood, nationhood, and relationships to ancestral lands that have occurred as a result of the continuum of colonialism, chattel enslavement, and neo-colonialism. From the perspective of just, transformative, and holistic repair, paying reparations is a response to the generational impacts of the exploitations and dispossessions caused by the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. Just repair, therefore, focuses on justly restoring all that was violently taken away from enslaved Africans and their descendants. Just repair emphasizes, among other things, agency and dignity restoration, as well as resources restoration to descendants. It also emphasizes descendants' central role in leadership and participation in reparations policy and decision-making, as opposed to being relegated to a status of mere beneficiaries, where reparations programs are designed as exploitative aid schemes. Furthermore, just repair emphasizes addressing the root causes and manifestations of slavery and colonization, that's a quote, and challenging unequal and intersecting power relationships as well as structures of domination and exclusion. The concepts of just repair and just reparations are therefore focused on the restoration of sovereignty and self-determination, as well as the redistribution of wealth, resources, and power to address the collective and individual socioeconomic harms, injustice, and rights violations that have, to address the collective and individual socioeconomic harms, injustice, and rights violations that have occurred. In closing, I wish to draw our attention to the second part of this presentation's title, Colonization. Thomas Theodore Hines' 1904's cartoon titled, That's How the Englishman Colonizes, that's the meaning German there, provides a starting point that highlights how Christian missionaries, alongside agents of European commerce in Africa, contributed to the squeezing of gold out of African bodies and their environment. So you can see the gold pieces over there. In the cartoon, the force feeding of whiskey, see that on the side. In the cartoon, the force feeding of whiskey seems to symbolize the imposition of consumerism, both of alcohol and other similarly addictive forms of consumption, designed to numb Africans held in the colonizer's vice, presented here as a machine. Machine there. This numbing effect is intended to prevent effective resistance against their fate within colonial rule. In the image, the clergy's presence symbolizes Christianity's role in endorsing the activity. Notably, the cleric is portrayed as passive, neither intervening in nor interrupting the process, but instead continuing his religious duties, illustrating that his role aligned with the colonial enterprise. The image provides us a summary of colonization defined as an enterprise that seeks to control the colonized fully by taking over the colonized epistemic, economic, political, civic, and subjective or personal realms. Colonized African communities were numbed through Eurocentric norms of commerce and a forced conversion to a Eurocentric interpretation of Christianity that ensured that the colonized epistemic, economic, political, civic, and personal realms were under colonizers' control. Hines' illustration highlights the colonial view of Africans as machines through whom wealth could be extracted. They are, quote, the human body and not the steam engine, and not even the clock that was the first machine developed by capitalism. Like the two Onesimuses highlighted in this presentation, they are part of the useful, exploited, and silenced in the narrative. The Scramble for Africa, an outcome of the Berlin Conference that went from 1884 to 1885, formally launched the continent's colonization by European countries. According to Rebecca Kulik, in the 1870s, 10% of Africa was under European control. But by 1914, the figure was 90%. And keeping an eye on Africans' supposed usefulness, W. Winwood Reid wrote that labor would lead to the extinction of people on the African continent. Relying on social Darwinist ideas, he expected that superior England and France would rule Africa at a time when Africans would have become extinct by laboring for these two countries to make the continent habitable for the English and the French. He argued that the extinction of Africans ought to be regarded with composure, as it, quote, illustrates the beneficent law of nature that the weak must be devoured by the strong. As Christianity spread across the continent, its close ties to colonization pushed converts to abandon their heritage in a process Vuyani Vellum described as a process of spiritualicide, do not pronounce that one, a process that involves the use of the combination of religion and the culture of a colonizing society to both convert and spiritually and culturally assimilate the colonized. In biblical narratives, this assimilation can be illustrated by Genesis 27, where Isaac, whose eyesight is failing, observes that Jacob, posing as Esau, sounds like himself, but has the hands of Esau, verse 23. In a similar way, an assimilated individual or society may express themselves, such as through epistemic traditions, in ways that differ from their social and cultural heritage. In other words, the methods Christian missionaries used during the colonial framework positioned the converted individual or society to mimic the colonizer at the expense of their heritage, their identity, and agency. Conversion methods in such conditions did not and do not prioritize consent. And this is just an example from Malawi, where I come from, of how some of that happened. All this is not really past, since the legacies of the past 500 years are still with us. True and just repair requires moving beyond simplistic notions such as dialogue, Christian kinship, mutual growth, and so on. Instead, acknowledging the role of power in this history and addressing the historical harms is what is essential in the process of a genuine healing of these harms. The epistle to Philemon is often misused, partly because Onesimus's perspective is absent. Had his voice been included, his experiences might have revealed how unjust systems of power rarely yield to justice. Unjust systems of power are often resistant to change. They adapt and resurface, maintaining their oppressive patterns. Today, as scholars like Vuyani Vellum have stated, the ghost of empire returns to haunt us and will continue to do so if it and its impact remain untouched. To break these recurring cycles, just repair is essential. Just repair centers descendants in reparations processes, affirming their rightful authority to determine the appropriate course for just repair, including compensation and comprehensive material and symbolic reparations that acknowledge and compensate for the harms inflicted. Thank you.
Our second keynote with Professor Anthony Reddie. So I have to introduce Anthony, but I'm sure I don't need to. But I think we do want to recognise, support and encourage Anthony and all the work that he's done over the years, because it's not always been an easy path that Anthony has pioneered, and many of us in this room will have benefited greatly from his scholarship, from his committed activism, and from his support, even though those times have not always been easy for him. So formally we need to say, I think, Anthony is the first black professor of theology in this august institution. He is the founder of the Centre for Black Theology, Tier 2, and just in recent days in South Africa it was released that Anthony is considered in the top classification of research output in South Africa as a professor, visiting professor of UNISA, and in that context he also becomes the first black professor in South Africa in theology and religious studies to have that recognition from the South African government. So always pioneering, always pushing us forward, always a joy to be in your presence, Anthony. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I invariably try to start my talks by saying the following. I say invariably because I don't always do it. I try to do it. I am Anthony Reddie, and I am a descendant of enslaved Africans. Reddie is my father's name, and I'm proud of it, although I didn't always like it when I was a kid. It is open to teasing and people taking the piss when I was a kid. So I didn't always love Reddie when I was a kid, but I'm proud to be called Reddie now. But to state the obvious, it's not an African name. It's a Scottish name. And I say that because there is a temptation oftentimes when we have these conversations to think that they are very arid, kind of intellectual abstractions. And they're not. That for a lot of us, even the names we carry themselves are problematic and we have to do something with them or learn to live with them or find some accommodation. So this is not simply an intellectual exercise, even though a place like Oxford loves that kind of intellectualising. It's actually very existential and dare one say an ontological challenge in terms of the very nature of our being. Also, I want to say that this talk I'm giving, so the title is A Biblical and Theological Case for Reparations. And what I have done in the talk is to take a very strong biblical position, which is not necessarily my ordinary theology as a liberationist. I have been taught and have learned to read against and critique scripture. So part of my critique of the Onesimus story that we heard so brilliantly, actually deconstructed by Thandi, is to realise that just because it's in the Bible don't make it good. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't always make it good. And the mistake I think that's been made is to say, well, okay, so here's a biblical exemplar that we should use as our paradigm. But as our first speaker so brilliantly told us, Onesimus has no agency. He has no sense of self-determination. It's about him without him. Mm-hmm. And somehow that should be a model that we should follow. Well, it's only a model we should follow if we still want to do what was done in the past, which is to do it about us without us. Hopefully, if we're not going to do that, then that's not a model we should follow. And so, although I'm taking a very biblical approach to this, I'm doing it on purpose because, I guess to put this work into context, I first began to think about a theological and biblical case for reparations in 2005, so exactly 20 years ago. And one of my first outings was at a conference in Swanwick, an ecumenical conference, which my brother Regent was present. And he can testify that I'm not exaggerating about this, but it went down like the proverbial lead balloon. People hated it. Didn't just dislike it, they hate it. And there were people in that room who tried to both destabilise work I was doing, but certainly trying to destabilise work that Richard was doing at the time for Church Together in England, as a means of I guess, robustly reasserting their white privilege, which was to say, how dare someone like me dare get up and call white people to account for the nature of their cheap grace around what they talk about reconciliation, but never talk about justice. So part of what I'm offering, both in this paper but also in these remarks, is to acknowledge that we're at an interesting time. That the very fact that we have this conference and we're talking about reparations itself is remarkable, because until quite recently, it was not uncommon for very, very seemingly important white patriarchs of various institutions to say there was no conversation to be had. That actually even trying to raise the R word itself was illegitimate, let alone what might come out of it. It's interesting that next week, so a week today in the evening, Oxford University has voluntarily decided that it too will have a conversation about reparations. And it's one that has been led by two of the most privileged colleges in Oxford. So, like there are Oxford colleges and Oxford College. So we're Oxford College. but we kind of Oxford light, to be truthful. Concentrated Oxford are places like Balliol and Trinity colleges, and they're the ones who are sponsoring a conversation on reparations next Thursday. If you'd have said to me, I came here in January 2020, that Oxford University would unilaterally, openly say, let's have a conversation about reparations, I'd have thought that you were crazy. So clearly something is happening that is given space to have that conversation, and being a liberationist who always has a hermeneutic of suspicion, there's a part of me that says, so why do they want to have the conversation now? Because for many years, as I said, it was impossible to even raise. So yes, I'm happy to have the conversation, but let's keep our suspicion open about why it is that people who have no vested interest in being involved in this now want to talk about it. So in this paper, I'm offering a biblical information. It's largely old work that I'm kind of revisiting and offering some new comments. But just to show how old it is, if you want to see the original version in my 2008 book called Working Against the Grain, a book that also came out at the time and sunk without a trace. Probably a close family and 2 dogs and maybe 2 friends read it. But anyway, that book is up also now still in print and still be popular. So if there's a cynical tone to this, it's quite deliberate, because I'm cynical. I'm pleased that the college have encouraged me to have a Black Theology Centre, but again, I'm still cynical about that. So I'm asking, in the midst of this, I'm asking critical questions which I don't have the answer to, but I invite you to reflect on as well. That one thing we know about our interpretation of time and space, it's never an exact science. Paul Tillich says that we live our lives forwards, but we understand backwards. So it'll be interesting to see what history makes of this moment. It could either be a great Kairos moment, a moment in which God's purposes are revealed more fully, or it could be a false dawn. The truth is we don't know which of the two, but what we have to be mindful of is that unless we are purposeful in engaging in that conversation, it's probably more of a false dawn than a Kairos moment. So where to start? Well, one of the things I want to start with is in this work is the recognition that within the heart of the Christian project that has its roots in Judaism is the centrality of reconciliation. As we'll see, reconciliation, as our first speaker so aptly reminded us, is often problematic when done within the gaze of imbalance of power relationships. But yet that motif is there. It's a reconciliation between God and humankind. Reconciliation between humankind and others across cultural, social, political, ethnic, economic divide. I think it's also something I did not put in the original paper at the time, but I think has become much more clear now. It's a reconciliation between ourselves and the creation that we are destroying. Yeah. Sweet Honey in the Rock, probably one of my favourite artists, is African American a cappella group, and they have a song called If the Earth Could Speak, and they imagine Earth and creation as a battered woman who is running away from from the spouse who's battering, and the spouse who's battering her is us, humankind. If she could run away, because the truth is that the only thing that's wrong with creation is us. It's not all the other creatures do what they do. We're the ones who, in balance of it, has imperiled everybody else. We're the problem. And so they imagine if the earth could just get away and just run away and leave us behind. Because actually we're the problem. Or, to be more accurately, white, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalists are the problem. So what does reconciliation look like between that? And then, I guess, reconciliation within ourselves. Paul's writings form the earliest documented text in the New Testament, and within all of Paul's writings is this notion of the reconciling work that is done by Christ. And so just a few references. One can point to Romans 5:10, or 1 Corinthians 5:14 to 21, 2 Corinthians 5:18 to 20, Colossians 1:18 to 23, and the list goes on, in which Paul talks about the importance of the reconciling work done in Christ. But what we also need to hold in tension, which is something that I will draw on in a moment, is that you can't understand this unless you also read it in terms of Jewish theology and practice. Because one of the dangers of, as we saw in the Onesimus example, is the danger of over-spiritualizing what reconciliation looks like. If you over-spiritualize it, then what you do is take out of context and take it away from material, social and political and cultural relationships, and end up, as I'll show shortly, in a matter of cheap grace, which is where you have reconciliation, but essentially nothing has changed. So Onesimus is meant to be reconciled with Philemon, but go back and still be a slave. And somehow that's fine. And so much of what we have seen in the context of our existing conversations, so our two friends from the Netherlands, it was interesting how you said, if I heard correctly, that there's no financial reparations, but yet the government basically want forgiveness. Okay, so forgiveness, but not restoring anything in the meantime, but they still want forgiveness. It's essentially a form of, I think, a spiritual and theological placebo. So if we want to talk about reconciliation, and we want to talk about it within a theological and biblical context, let's say within a Judeo-Christian framework, then we have to anchor this within the Jewish antecedents. So in order to make sense of reconciliation, we have to understand the Jewish antecedents that informs Paul's writing, because Paul himself is a Jewish man. In the Hebrew scriptures and in Jewish thought, atonement and salvation are collective and corporate concepts. This is very different to much of what constitutes post-Reformation evangelicalism in the Protestant tradition, where emphasis is upon individual salvation in Christ by grace through faith. And yes, there is a truth in that, but it's an impoverished truth. Because the nature of that individualization is what then allows in history, and we say this with almost a calm impunity, that you could have Christian slaveholders. You would have thought that would be a complete oxymoron. But Christian slaveholders who would believe genuinely that under the Pauline dictum that they themselves had been saved by grace through faith, that had no implication on the slaves they held or the material interests they still held on to through slavery. And some of the heroes that we hold up within our different church traditions are ones that often fail the test when you ask that critical question around in what way were their material interests changed by their conversion, and invariably they never were. But my other friends who had been on this long journey with me, and we'll hear from him a little bit later, is Reverend Dr. Michael Jagasan. Michael did a wonderful paper a number of years ago, back in 2007, where he looked at the life and legacy of a guy called Nathaniel Gilbert. Now, Nathaniel Gilbert was from Antigua and is one of the antecedents of the Methodist tradition in the Caribbean. So he was a Methodist. He comes back to Britain, I think, when his parents died, although he's a planter in the Caribbean. And whilst he's here in the 1740s or something like that, he gets converted to Christianity, becomes part of this, I guess, evangelical spiritual uprising, and then goes back to the Caribbean and helps to spread the Methodist word. And he's seen as a great exemplar. Like, there are lots of churches named after him. But what gets missed in the history books, and Michael was the first one really to call it out, is the fact that like, he was still a slave trader. No, sorry, he was still a slave owner. His life was transformed by the wonderful outworking of the Holy Spirit that it did sod off for his slaves. Except for the fact that they did convert to Christianity themselves. Yet there's no church named after any of them. Only a church named after him. And when Michael dared to write his paper and to critique it, and also had to critique John Wesley, all hell broke loose when myself, Michael and Carol were all at Queen's Foundation at the time. So much so that it's the closest I've ever come to get into a fist fight with a student. I mean, literally, you know, I mean, I see Carol here kind of wincing because at that point, I mean, someone had to come and separate. It got that heated. Because for the students, how dare someone like Michael come and take a black hermeneutic that was trying to spoil their history of all these good, saintly white people we want to hold up as heroes, even though when you look at history, their feet are covered in mud. So we have to retain an understanding that has a collective understanding of righteousness, not just an individualization. Essentially, being righteous, being right standing with God necessitates that one should be in right relationships with others. In fact, one could argue that it appears to be the case that one cannot be in a right relationship with God unless you are doing right by Him. And that isn't just a spiritual contract, it's also a material and a cultural and a political one. And they both can be seen, for example, in Leviticus 6, verses 1 to 6. And these verses clearly state the notion of restorative justice for that which has been taken and that which is being used without permission. And it's described clearly as a sin, not just against the people who you have despoiled, it's a sin against God. So within the Hebrew scriptures, there is clearly a sense of a restorative justice that has a collectivist ethic to it, not just an individual. And so we can see this formula in Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 8. And the key verse for me is verse 12, which says, and I quote, if any of you buy Israelites as slaves, you must set free after 6 years. And don't just tell them that they're free to leave. Give them sheep and goats and a supply of grain and wine. End of quote. As Peter Crutchley's work has done, so Peter Crutchley now works for the World Council of Churches, but he was a former colleague. I'm about to say former friend, it's not a friend, but he's a former colleague in the Council of World Mission. And Peter's work on the Zacchaeus tax campaign has shown that in the Hebrew Bible tradition, the traditions of Sabbath and Jubilee were moments of system reset. And they were about dismantling inequalities that had been accrued over the previous 50 years. They were moments of breaking the cycle of ongoing basis of debt and economic enslavement. And of course, it's worth reminding ourselves again, as our first speaker, Thandi, so eloquently reminded us, of the hypocrisy of people who are saying, but we can't have reparations because there's no precedent for it. Oh, there is. Actually, there's lots of precedent for it. It's just that you give the money to the oppressors, not the oppressed. £20 million in the British context was given to those who owned slaves, but not a penny to those who were the enslaved. And therefore it's worth reminding ourselves that not one penny has been given to the descendants of enslaved Africans for the wrong that was done to them. And yet Christian communities in the West still want to talk about redemption that is affirmed by our Judeo-Christian roots. The key work in terms of how we make the connection between then and now is one of the arguments you say, for example, when I quote from Deuteronomy to say, well, because this is about Jewish people. actually one of the critiques you can make of this work, and certainly when I think back to how what I wrote at the time, how I would update it, is by working with the Judeo-Christian tradition, we're still then having to wrestle with something that was mentioned this morning also by our first speaker, which is the notion of election. The notion of election runs all the way through various Jewish and Christian theologies and is often like the basis of liberation. So whereas historically one would have seen election as a particular group of people in their relationship to God, that's the Hebrew scriptures, and then within, I guess, Protestant, perhaps evangelical theology, that notion of election switches from a particular group of people in terms of land and culture to a group of people who have a relationship with Jesus in terms of atonement. Then a liberationist ethic then would say actually that sense of elections end with those who are oppressed. Problem with all those models is that you still have a binary of those who are elected, but what about the ones who are not elected? And therefore, one of the critiques I would make of my own paper, which I freely acknowledge, is, so what happens if the Judeo-Christian traditions are not the ones in which you have defined your humanity? What about people who come from other perspectives? What if, for example, you are from an enslaved background like myself, but let's say that your religion of choice, or even your religion of ancestry, is Islamic, for example? Does that mean all bets are off for you because, like, you're not sitting within a particular camp or a particular framework? So I'm willing to open up that critique, and maybe that then maps onto the challenge that Michael gave us around actually how redemptive is this Christian project, and can it ever somehow make up for all that was taken and lost, especially if it still works with a privilege and a kind of essentializing that says that yes, God is on everybody's side, but really on some people's side more than others. Which is what a liberationist ethic still says. It just recalibrates who's the one who's elected, as opposed to those who are not. But for me, the clear connection between then and now is the work of post-colonial scholars. And they remind us that what we have in common, particularly with the era of Jesus, is this sense of empire and its control of bodies and people and land and resources. That post-colonial hermeneutics emerges when the reader recognises that in the context in which every aspect of the New Testament canon is written was composed as one that echoes, I guess, the restrictive claims of colonialism. Judea, which Jesus' ministry is largely located, was an occupied colony of the Roman Empire. We've largely found ways of omitting that from our theological context, because the truth is, once Britain becomes the largest owner and control of any empire the world's ever seen, it's no longer in our interest, like to see the Romans as villains. It's much more easy like to blame the Jews. Actually, in another piece of work, my book, I think it's the book I did on James Cone, one of the things I do is to take Cone's essential identification as Jesus as a colonised Jew, but just extend it much further and say, but actually that's our fundamental problem as Christians in a particular country, is that when it comes to Easter, particularly actually when we read that iconic passage from John, where Jesus is in conversation with Pontius Pilate, we imagine ourselves to be the inheritors of Jesus, and so we sit there and we read this and we think Pilate is a villain. And actually Pilate is a villain indeed, but let's be honest with you, Britain had lots of Pontius Pilates all over the world. He is simply an apparatchik of Rome who is sent in order to keep the rebellious people in Judea and other parts of that world in place and keep them in order. And we've had lots of versions of Pontius Pilate, who is doing the bidding of a Christian church that surrendered to empire. And whilst I'm here with some good Welsh friends of mine in the room, sorry about the rugby, Michael, sorry about the rugby. But I do support Wales at rugby. as you well know. Sorry about the Actually, it's important to remember that such is the entanglement of empire, that it's perfectly possible for two things to be equally true. So you can be a victim of English colonialism and yet still be on the wrong side of history when it comes to partake in slavery. There are lots of enslaved, descendants of enslaved people who have Welsh names and Scottish names like Reddie. So it's to remind them that actually all aspects of the British family are tied up in this. So Irish got oppressed and they were still involved in, because what we have to deconstruct is whiteness. Oh, by the way, and obviously if you haven't got the book that Carol and I did, then there's little copies at the back and they're given away for free. But yes, but what we're doing in that book of Deconstructing Whiteness is to remind ourselves that there are different levels of colonisation. Scots and Welsh and Irish were indeed actually colonised by the English, and we make it easy to see them as the ultimate villains, but yet there's nothing in history that suggests that there's other parts of the British family somehow find it so offensive that they refuse to get involved. So post-colonial hermeneutics reminds us that the era of Jesus, the first century, is not as different as we would imagine. And scholars such as Musa Dube and Randall Bailey and Fernando Segovia have all shown this relationship between capital accumulation and economic exploitation. It's why it's so provocative that when Jesus meets the rich young ruler, Mark 10, 17 to 27, or Matthew 19, 22, he says to him to give away all he has and to come and follow him. And he says this in the knowledge that the young man's accumulation of wealth was not amassed in a neutral context. It was undoubtedly amassed through the process of exploitation. And therefore, holding on to exploitation and being part of the Jesus movement is incompatible. If it were now, we would say it's incompatible. But if you give enough money to us, I'm like, we'll give you a black. I say that in my own context because, as my brother will also know, that in the church we grew up in, that there was a guy who owned a mill. He was a mill owner, and his mill did not have union rights. The workers were exploited to the point whereby on Good Friday, because that was not a bank holiday, his own workers could not afford to take the day off, so they had to work while he could sit in church and say his prayers. And the church never said anything to him because he was probably the richest person in the church and gave the most money. So basically, tithe and generous giving always get around exploitation. Simply go to Bristol or look at all the places named after Edward Coast. So we have to see the kingdom of God that is pitted against colonial exploitation, and they're not the same things, even though we have conflated them post-Chalcedon. So the reason why I think the encounter between the reason why the encounter between the rich young ruler and Jesus is so conflated is because there is so much within that account, I think, that's taken for granted. I think it's the assumption that he knows that he has to give away his wealth. And as we know, he can't do it. His material interests still stand. That's not for us, that. Well, the other beauty fellow. Also in this context, that we have to remember, as Brenda shared early on, that the forerunner of Council for World Mission is the London Missionary Society. And one of its famous old boys, David Livingstone, is the one who said that the base of the British Empire was the 3 C's: commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Christianity becomes the religion of empire. So central to this empire is the entanglement both between colonial apparatchiks and missionary bodies. So the exporting of Christianity via the European missionary agencies of the 18th and 19th century was largely undertaken under the aegis of empire and colonialism. Christian mission, therefore, has a difficult relationship with non-white bodies of the subaltern. And for centuries, there's always been this marked divide between them and us. And the others invariably exploit for economic gain, and so hence that fantastic but very disturbing cartoon picture we saw. So very quickly, we're at the time. There's a continuum from then until now. And in light of post-colonial hermeneutics, what we can see is that Jesus' teachings around wealth and its relationship to discipleship, the living the Jesus way, has not just spiritual and theological implications, but has political and economic implications as well. And the work of post-colonial scholars have all shown the similarities between first century Palestine, the slave epoch of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the eras of colonialism that followed. And it's just worth noting that colonialism only really took off when chattel slavery was kind of ending. So essentially, like, you move from one type of exploitation to another. And as, again, our wonderful first speaker reminded us, that the Treaty of Berlin actually carves up a whole continent. And none from that continent is there to be privy to that contestation of the dividing of land. Because we don't matter. It just happens to be our lives and our land that's being divided. More recently, one of the heroes of the Black liberation struggle in South Africa has been Alan Boesak, who is a reformed theologian. And in his book, Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood-Red Waters, but in that, and I have to say it's a simply brilliant book. He used that title to talk about what does it mean to reflect on contemporary politics, certainly in South Africa, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, in which contestations around land and around legacies of slavery and colonialism are still live issues, and in which there's still the sense in which people will make apology if we're lucky, but it still hasn't apologised, by the way. But will ask for reconciliation without restitution or justice. And Boesak Boesak invokes the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and outlines the nature of cheap grace. And essentially that is that the West always has an attempt at reconciliation without sacrifice or without restorative justice. That essentially if you think that you can do reconciliation without having a material aspect to it, then it's cheap grace. If you think that you can do reparations on the cheap and it doesn't cost you anything, then it misses the whole point of what is meant to be reparation. And so if we want to talk about the cross, then we can talk about the very costly nature of Jesus' own sacrifice, which then gives rise to people who say that they're picking up their cross and following Jesus, having made no sacrifice at all. Bonhoeffer, writing in the German context, chided Western Christians, and really bracket what we mean white Christians, for wanting to have discipleship without radical commitment to God's word and forgiveness and redemption. No, sorry. Butchered that sentence. We'll try again. Bonhoeffer chided Western Christians for wanting to have discipleship without radical commitment to God's word and forgiveness and redemption without struggle and sacrifice. As Boesak reminds us, there is no redemption without the cross. But the cross costs. Reconciliation must cost us something. when Jesus says to his followers to pick up your cross and follow me, Matthew 16, 24, 26, Luke 19 to 23, that's not meant to be just a metaphorical spiritual cross. It is meant to be a cross that makes a deliberate attempt to be on the side of those who continue to be crucified on crosses of neoliberalism and capitalism and exploitation and land extraction and rampant poverty and lack of education. Due to the influence of our post-Reformation evangelicalism, we've largely interpreted Jesus' words as purely individualistic and spiritualized. But post-colonial scholars have shown, so this is my conclusion, that if we go back to the Jewish tradition, issues of reconciliation, redemption, and salvation have a corporate and collective dimension to them, as well as an individualistic one. So my final challenge, therefore, for all Christian institutions is that if we are truly to be Christian under the bounds of the faith that we say we proclaim and profess, then we have to acknowledge that cheap grace never leads to redemption and reconciliation. Without restorative justice, there can be no reconciliation. And the truth is, the mission of Christ will be utterly diminished. To me, I think there is no coincidence that many of our historic churches, the ones who have participated historically in transatlantic slavery, are the ones who are struggling the most at this moment in time in terms of our numbers and in terms of our dimension of our society. We can do as many kinds of theological eschatology that we want in terms of fresh expressions or stale expressions or new church or pub church or whatever type of new schism church you want to think of. We can do as many as we like and it ain't going to work. And it won't work because I think there is a broader sense now of the culpability of Christianity, that our mission has no integrity if we are not prepared to wrestle with the past. So I conclude with the words of one of my favourite writers, James Baldwin, who says this, and some of you may have heard this before, this from The Fire Next Time. He says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.